This is B4.2, ecological niches or niches. Depending on where you are in the world, you can pronounce that either way. Both are completely correct. So, first essential question. What are the advantages of specialized modes of nutrition to living organisms? And number two, how are the adaptations of a species related to its niche in an ecosystem? Let's begin by taking a look at how we define the ecological niche. This is the unique role that every species in an ecosystem fulfills. This can include both biotic and abiotic interactions that influence growth, survival, and reproduction. Now, each species is going to have certain zones of tolerance for abiotic variables. Let's look at this little bluebird, for example. Here you can see that it has a certain zone of tolerance for its prey length. So mostly it's going to look for prey that are in that 4 millimeter-ish range, but it can manage prey all the way till about 13 millimeters in size and all the way down to about 1 millimeter. But outside of that, the prey is going to be either too big or too small. Maybe it just can't fit it in its mouth, or maybe it even can't see it if it's too small. Similarly, it's going to hunt at a certain height above the ground. Here we can see in feet how high and how low on a tree this bluebird will hunt. This makes up part of this bluebird's niche. It is going to have a certain niche that is not able to be shared with other species. Even if it only hunts at a certain height in the tree, you could have a different species higher up in the tree, lower in the tree, or with a different prey, but you wouldn't be able to have any two species occupying that same niche or niche at the same time. Note that other species are utilized to provide a diverse range of services, for example, the supply of mineral elements by recycling, pollination of flowers, or dispersal of seeds. Okay, we have 3 new vocab terms that you need to be familiar with. We can place living organisms into one of these 3 categories according to their oxygen requirements. First up, we have our obligate aerobes. This just means they are obligated to use oxygen. Remember that aerobic cellular respiration requires oxygen, so that refers to the need for oxygen. So they're obligated to have oxygen. An obligate aerobe requires a continuous oxygen supply, so they only live in oxic or oxygen-containing environments. That's going to be all animals and plants, as well as, for example, this skin bacterium. In contrast, we have obligate anaerobes. These are obligated to have no oxygen in their environment. They actually are inhibited or killed by oxygen, so they live only in anoxic environments. Examples of which are the tetanus bacterium, some methanogenic archaea. Third category are our facultative anaerobes. Now these use oxygen if available, so they can live in either oxic or anoxic environments, for example, E. coli and yeast. Note some examples of anoxic conditions which have no oxygen include swamps, waterlogged soils or muds, intestinal tracts or guts of animals, and deep in lakes or seas. Next up, photosynthesis is the mode of nutrition in plants, algae, and several groups of photosynthetic prokaryotes. Let's compare an autotroph to a heterotroph. An autotroph is an organism that can convert energy into organic compounds. Picture plants. I like to think of it as automatically making energy, not requiring consumption of other organisms. This could be using light or using chemicals. We also then have heterotrophs, the other major group. These are organisms that take its nutrition from other organisms. We are included in this. Anything basically other than a plant that does photosynthesis or an archaea that does chemosynthesis, which we'll talk about later, is going to be a heterotroph. And it is going to need to consume other organisms, plants or animals, in order to get their nutrition. Let's look at photosynthesis. We remember that there's energy from sunlight that is used to fix carbon dioxide. We use carbon from that process to produce sugars, amino acids, and many other compounds on which life is based. Now we have 3 categories of photosynthesizers: plants, including mosses, ferns, conifers, and flowering plants; eukaryotic algae, including seaweeds that grow on rocky shores, as well as unicellular algae such as chlorella; and thirdly, several groups of bacteria, including cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green bacteria, and purple bacteria. That means photosynthesis occurs in 2 of the 3 domains of life. In eukaryotes, which remember are going to be organisms that have a nucleus, and we just mentioned plants. And in bacteria, we just mentioned purple bacteria as well as blue-green bacteria or cyanobacteria, but not in Archaea. So we're not going to have any of these be photosynthesizers. All animals are heterotrophic because they obtain supplies of carbohydrates, amino acids, and other carbon compounds by consuming other organisms. Molecules such as polysaccharides, remember that refers to complex sugars, and proteins have to be digested before they can be absorbed. Digestion in most animals happens internally after the food has been ingested. This is like what humans do, and we call that Holozoic nutrition. So whole pieces of food are swallowed, and then our digestive system breaks them down after that. So let's look at the process of Holozoic nutrition. Step 1, ingestion, taking the food into the gut. We call that eating. Then digestion. This is where food molecules get broken into smaller molecules. It starts for humans in the mouth with both mechanical digestion from the teeth chewing, plus chemical digestion from the amylase enzymes in your saliva, and it continues all the way down to your stomach before we can then have absorption occur in the small intestine. This is where transport of digested food across the plasma membrane of those epidermis, those lining cells, and thus into the blood and tissues of the body. But this can't happen until it's broken down into its component parts. Okay, those parts, component parts, then are assimilated. They can be used by cells to synthesize new proteins and other macromolecules, thus making them part of the body's tissues. The last step then is egestion, voiding undigested material from the end of the gut. Basically, the fancy scientific way of saying pooping. Now, we just mentioned Holozoic nutrition is specifically for internal digestion, but note that there are also some animals that digest their food externally, and so we would not consider that Holozoic. Spiders, for example, inject digestive enzymes into their prey. The digestion happens then externally, and then they just suck out the liquids produced of the digested material. They can absorb the products of digestion then in their gut, just like in Holozoic nutrition, and then assimilate them. But that is external digestion, so we don't consider that Holozoic. This is also how fungi digest, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, not everything fits neatly into one category or another. We also are going to have mixotrophic nutrition. This is where organisms are not exclusively autotrophic or heterotrophic and instead use a mix of both. We could either, again, here's that word facultative, which means that they can kind of go both ways depending on the conditions. So facultative mixotrophs can either be entirely autotrophic, entirely heterotrophic, or use both modes. An example of this is this Euglena gracilis. There's chloroplasts, and so it has photosynthesis when there's sufficient light, but it can also feed on detritus or smaller organisms by endocytosis, where the membrane folds around that food and brings it in. We then have that obligate word show up again, obligate mixotrophs. They are obligated to be mixotrophs. They can't grow unless they use both autotrophic and heterotrophic modes of nutrition. Chrysophytes, golden algae will not grow when exposed to light without prey. Saprotrophs. These are going to be our fungi and many types of bacteria, and they have external digestion, just like that spider I mentioned a minute ago. The way that they work is they grow on dead organic matter like dying trees, and they excrete their digestive enzymes into whatever they're wanting to break down and eat. Then after that external digestion occurs, they can absorb the products of digestion back into the fungi to help them grow. Remember that fungi are not photosynthesizers. That's a common misconception, that they kind of look like plants. They're usually growing on plants. So sometimes they are classified as plants, but that is wrong. They are their own category. They are fungi. They don't photosynthesize. Instead, they're saprotrophs that do external digestion and then absorb the products of that digestion. They can also be referred to as decomposers because they break down carbon compounds in dead organic matter. They release elements such as nitrogen back into the ecosystem, allowing it to be used again by other organisms. So back now to Archaea. Archaea are one of the 3 domains of life. They're very varied in how they obtain energy for ATP production. They're unicellular and have no nucleus, which is the same as bacteria. But in other respects, Archaea are closer to eukaryotes with a nucleus. And you can see that they even share a more recent common ancestor than either of these groups with bacteria. Now, there's 3 main categories of how Archaea obtain energy for ATP production. We have phototropic production, where we have light energy absorbed by pigments, chemotrophic, oxidation of inorganic chemicals, and heterotrophic, where we have oxidation of carbon compounds obtained from other organisms. Next up, the relationship between dentition and the diet of omnivorous and herbivorous representative members of the family Hominidae. The family Hominidae includes the genera, that's just plural for genus, that contains humans, orangutans, gorilla, and chimpanzees. Some members of the Hominidae family have an exclusively herbivorous diet, while others are omnivorous and eat both plants and meat. We're going to see that there's a relationship between diet and dentition, or the arrangement of teeth. In herbivores, we're going to see larger teeth, and they're going to be really flat molars that are going to grind down tough fibrous plant tissues. In contrast, we're going to see that in omnivores, we have a mix of different types of teeth. We're going to have some smaller molars. They won't be as large and flat. We also have some canines and incisors that are a little bit sharper as omnivores ourselves to be able to tear tougher food like meat with our teeth. Now, you don't have to look at carnivores. Remember, we're just focusing on omnivores and herbivores within members of the family Hominidae. But just for comparison, you can see here what the molars, premolars, canines, and incisors look on carnivores. Here's those big canines, sharper molars and premolars, and sharp incisors. So looking again at herbivores, we're going to see these really wide, flat molars. Their front teeth here are just going to help them to bite the plant matter, as opposed to omnivores, where we have these rounder, smaller molars and some sharper front teeth. We even have these canines, but they're, again, pretty blunted. So looking here at the jaw of a Homo sapiens, a human, you can see here that omnivorous, smaller, round molars. Here's the canines, the incisors. So let's look now at 2 other members of the family Hominidae and what their teeth patterns look like. As an application of skills, IB would like students to examine models or digital collections of skulls to infer diet from the anatomical features. Examples may include Homo sapiens, modern humans, as seen here. And we'll compare that then to a digital photo of the Homo floresiensis and Paranthropus robustus species. So as we can see here, humans have an omnivorous diet. We have those smaller, more rounded molars. We have relatively sharp canines and incisors. So let's compare that now to these other 2 species. Now, Homo floresiensis definitely had an omnivorous diet as well. You can see their teeth look a lot like modern human teeth. You can see these rounded, smaller molars and some sharper canines and incisors, even though some of them are broken off here because this is a fossil. This species doesn't exist anymore. And then here is the Paranthropus robustus. This particular species had much more of a herbivorous tendency. You can see these larger, wide, flat molars. Although there is evidence there may also have been some meat in their diet by some of these sharper front teeth, these large, flat molars indicating a primarily herbivorous diet. Now note that both of these species are extinct. They don't exist anymore. And so we can use deductions made from theories. We can make observations of the living members of the family Hominidae to allow the diet of extinct organisms to then be deduced. Next up, adaptations of herbivores for feeding on plants and of plants for then resisting herbivory. So first up, herbivores, again, are animals that feed exclusively on plants. Let's look at insects. Insects fall into 2 major categories in terms of their mouth part types. We're going to see that insects' mouth parts show great diversity, but they are all homologous. They have been derived by evolution from the same ancestral mouth parts. Most insects are herbivores. So here's our two broad groups. First up, the insects with jaw-like mouth parts. Beetles are an example. This frog beetle has a little jaw-like mouth that's going to be used to bite, chew, and ingest pieces of a leaf. In contrast, aphids have this more tubular mouth part, and this is going to allow these bugs to pierce leaves to reach those phloem sieve tubes, which remember are how those sugars move through plants. That sugary water is called sap, and that's the food for these aphids that are then able to drink it up through this tubular mouth part. Now, plants then again want to resist herbivory. So here's a few ways they do so. Number one, some plants have tough, sharp-pointed thorns or spines, as seen here by these spines on a leaf stalk of the fan palm. Some plants have stings to cause pain, as you can see here by this tree nettle, which is endemic to New Zealand. This is someone who's just been stung by the tree nettle. And some synthesize secondary compounds in seeds and leaves that are toxic to herbivores. This is a milkweed plant. It synthesizes toxic glycosides to deter herbivores. That works for most, but this is a really interesting example. These aphids have gone through natural selection and have evolved to be resistant and tolerate the glycosides, but with another benefit of when consuming the glycosides, they themselves become toxic to their own potential predators. So we're going to see that some animals have metabolic adaptations for detoxifying these toxins. Next up, adaptations of predators for finding, catching, and killing prey, and of prey animals for resisting predation. Now, predators are adapted to find suitable prey, then catch and kill it, like these lions. Prey species are adapted to resist predation, like this buffalo with its sharp horns. These adaptations may be structural, chemical, or behavioral. So let's look at an example of each of these, both for a predator and a prey. So first up, a physical or structural adaptation. In a predator, here we have a vampire bat. Looking at its unique dentition, look how sharp those teeth are. They have small premolars and no molars, but relatively large incisors, these front teeth, and canines on their upper jaw that are pointed and razor sharp. They are used to pierce prey, so the vampire bat can feed on the blood. Next, this is a buff-tipped moth, and it is camouflaged to resemble broken birch twigs. And they roost during daylight hours on twigs or on the ground, and they need to hide because this is the time when they are most vulnerable to predation because they are actually night-flying moths. Next type of adaptation are chemical adaptations. In predators, we see that black mambas produce venom that contains a mixture of neurotoxins, including an inhibitor of the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, like we saw with our neonicotinoid pesticides. Remember that this is going to prevent the neurons from being able to pass a signal onto the muscles to tell them to contract, leading to paralysis, just like we saw with bees with neonicotinoid pesticides. The venom paralyzes prey when injected via poison fangs. The snake can then swallow the prey without it resisting. Now, on the prey side, we're going to see that caterpillars of the cinnabar moth, as seen here, feed on ragwort, and they accumulate toxic alkaloids from this plant. Their black and yellow stripes are warning coloration, which deters predators. Third and final type of adaptation category are behavioral adaptations. Here, under predators, we have grizzly bears. They learn ambush strategies for catching migrating salmon. They might do this by trial and error or by copying others. Some bears wait, like this one at the top of waterfalls, for a fish to jump out of the water. Others put their heads underwater and watch for a fish swimming past. Prey also have some behavioral adaptations. An example of the blue striped snappers that swim in a tight group, often with sudden changes of direction, called schooling behavior. This reduces the chance of predation because threats are more likely to be detected if you have 100 fish in a school. That's a lot of eyes looking for threats. And it's also difficult for a predator to catch any just one single individual in the bewildering shoal. Note that these behavioral adaptations can change relatively quickly. A bear can learn behaviors within its own lifetime, but structural adaptations are going to take much longer to develop because there has to be genetic change. Natural selection has to occur. And chemical adaptations of the three categories are usually the slowest to change because new enzymes may be needed. This may take millions of years for the right mutations to occur. Next up, adaptations of plant form for harvesting light. Environments like this one, where there's enough water for abundant plant growth and the temperature is suitable for photosynthesis, plants are going to compete for light. Light is our limiting factor, and forest ecosystems then develop. We're going to outline 5 different strategies for plants to be able to access light. Number 1, trees. Trees try to access light by just growing up as tall as possible. They have a dominant leading shoot. It grows rapidly to great height to reach the forest canopy, where they are unshaded by other trees and therefore can harvest light. The second group are the lianas. Lianas climb through other trees using them for support. And here you can see in this light green, this liana that's wrapped itself around a tree in order to try to reach light above the canopy. Lianas don't need to produce as much xylem tissue or wood as freestanding trees because they are using those trees as support. Next, you'll see here nestled in these branches, these are epiphytes here and here. They grow on those trunks and branches of trees. That helps them to grow up higher, where there's going to be more light intensity than if they grew on the forest floor. But the negative there is that there's going to be minimal soil for their roots. Next strategy are strangler epiphytes, and this is not a great picture of them. And so I put in a couple of other pictures to be able to visualize it better. Now, this strangler epiphyte is growing up on the outside of a tree here. It starts up above, but then it grows down and up, completely surrounding the tree, outgrows its branches, shades out the leaves of the tree, and eventually the tree dies, leaving only the epiphyte. And that's shown here later in this picture, where the tree is completely died and been decomposed. Lastly, we have some shade-tolerant shrubs and herbs. They grow on the forest floor, absorbing just whatever little light is able to get all the way down through the canopy. Next, fundamental and realized niches. Living organisms tolerate a range of biotic and abiotic conditions, but their specific adaptations don't allow them to survive outside this particular range. So what we have here is the fundamental niche. This is where a species can potentially survive based on its adaptations and tolerance limits. Let's take a look at this species of fish. It has a specific temperature tolerance range. It can tolerate up to a certain temperature and down to a certain temperature. It also has a salinity tolerance range. Okay, it can go up to a certain amount of salinity and down to a certain amount. So this blue outline here represents the fundamental niche, where it can potentially live. However, what we see here is the realized niche. This is where it actually lives, indicated by in blue as well, but you'll see it's a much smaller region because it's in competition with other species. And the way it interacts with other species is going to dictate where it actually lives. Note here, parasites are common at high temperatures for this fish species, and so they are not going to live in this part of their fundamental niche. And here we see that prey species cannot tolerate high salinity, and so they're not going to occupy this part of the fundamental niche. Instead, they're going to occupy only the realized niche, this blue area here. So a realized niche is a subset of a fundamental niche. Lastly, competitive exclusion and the uniqueness of ecological niches. We talked about this at the very beginning of this video when we looked at the bluebird, and we talked about how that bluebird just couldn't live in the same niche as another bird species that wanted the same prey and the same nesting spots and all the things that make up a particular niche. Competitive exclusion is where the fundamental niches of two species overlap. One species is expected to exclude the other from that part of its range by competition. A classic example of competitive exclusion are these two organisms, P. aurelia and P. caudatum. When grown in separate cultures, separate petri dishes, we'll see that both of these organisms experience high levels of population growth, followed by a plateau. Note, however, that when they're combined and they were in the same petri dish, while both experienced initial increases in population growth, P. aurelia was able to outcompete P. caudatum, leading to the extinction of P. caudatum over time. So these two organisms that share the same niche could not live in the same location at the same time. And we see here that possible outcomes of competition could either be, like we see here, elimination completely of one of the competing species, or the restriction of both species to a part of their fundamental niche as possible outcomes of competition between two species. So, for example, we might see one fish species occupying this part of the fundamental niche and one part over here, and they would have two different realized niches within a shared fundamental niche. All right, that's it for B4.2. Good luck out there.